Ireland, a green island on the edge of Europe, wrapped in the mists of the Atlantic. An island that for centuries seemed like a world living by its own rules, a land of Celtic legends, monasteries, and uprisings. But did you know that this land has gone through such upheavals that its history has become a lesson in how empires break nations and how nations refuse to be broken? What happened to the island the Romans were afraid to conquer? The Vikings raided for centuries, and the English tried to wipe from the face of the earth its culture and its language. Why did a country that gave the world saints and scholars in the early Middle Ages become, by the modern era, a place from which millions fled from hunger? And how, from the ashes of these catastrophes, did a modern nation emerge, a nation that managed to win back its freedom and build its own state? The history of Ireland is not just a sequence of wars and invasions. It is the story of a clash between two worlds, the ancient Celtic and the modern European. A story of how language, religion, and memory become weapons of resistance. A story of what happens when a big country decides that a small one must disappear. And a story of what it means to survive when survival seems impossible. Suggest new topics in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about history, from ancient legends to modern tales, from historical facts to mysterious plots. Make yourself comfortable. We begin.
10,000 years ago, long before Celtic legends, long before saints and scholars, long before the first stones of Newgrange were lifted, Ireland was already alive. The first people arrived as the ice sheets retreated, following the coastline, living in a world of stone tools, campfires, and silent forests untouched by civilization. They hunted, they gathered, they moved with the seasons, and though they left behind only flint blades and traces of ancient hearths, their footsteps marked the beginning of human history on this island. Then, 6,000 years ago, everything changed. Farmers arrived, bringing grain, animals, pottery, and the first permanent settlements. They cleared forests, opened fields, and built something that still takes our breath away today, the megalithic tombs. Newgrange, North, Douth, massive monuments of earth and stone, with long corridors leading into the dark heart of the past. Newgrange itself is older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. And once a year, on the winter solstice, a beam of light slips through a narrow opening above the entrance and illuminates the inner chamber, a message carved in sunlight across 5 millennia. Who built these monuments? What did they believe? What stories filled their nights beneath the cold Atlantic sky? We may never know. But the stones remain, silent, immovable, watching as ages rise and fall.
Around 2,500 years ago, new waves of migrants began arriving in Ireland from the continent. They brought iron tools, new technologies, and a language that would come to define the island for centuries. These were the Celts, and their arrival transformed everything. But this was not an invasion that wiped out the old world. It was a merging,
a slow absorption of cultures. The people already living on the island didn't vanish. They became Celtic too. Over generations, Ireland turned into a patchwork of Celtic kingdoms. People spoke early Irish, the ancestor of modern Gaelic. They carried ancient beliefs, held sacred rituals, and lived by a tribal structure unique to this land. There was no single ruler, no unified state. Instead, the island was divided into countless tuatha, small tribal realms, each with its own king, its own borders, its own ambitions. Alliances were temporary, rivalries were eternal. Wars broke out, were settled, then broke out again. Honor, cattle, and reputation were the currencies of power. At the center of this world stood the Druids. Not simply priests, but the intellectual elite of Celtic society. Druids were judges, poets, philosophers, advisors to kings. They learned for 20 years, memorizing laws, genealogies, astronomical cycles, and vast epics recited entirely by heart. They could cross borders freely. They could stop battles with a single gesture. Their authority came not from weapons, but from knowledge. The Celtic world shimmered with artistry. Golden torques, bronze brooches, spiral motifs carved with impossible precision. Their feasts were loud, their halls filled with music and poetry. Their stories peopled with heroes, Cú Chulainn, Finn MacCool, Queen Medb. This was a vibrant civilization, one bound by tradition, power, poetry, and myth. And yet, for all their strength, one mighty empire looked across the Irish Sea and chose not to conquer them.
Rome conquered vast lands. It subdued Gaul, crushed Britannia, and stretched its empire across continents. And yet, one small island, lying just beyond their reach, remained untouched: Ireland. The Romans knew this island well. Traders crossed the sea. Geographers mapped its shores. Ptolemy even recorded the names of tribes living here. But the legions never came. Not a single Roman banner stood on Irish soil. Why? Some say Ireland simply wasn't worth the cost. It had no rich cities, no gold-filled temples, no central authority to negotiate with or to topple. To the Roman mind, Ireland was a land of scattered tribes, forests, bogs, and endless rain. A difficult place to conquer and an even harder place to hold. Others believe the Romans understood something crucial: that Ireland, unlike Britain, lacked the roads, towns, and political structures that made occupation possible. An Ireland without cities is an Ireland without control points, and Rome did not fight wars it couldn't profit from. Whatever the reason, Rome stayed away, and this decision reshaped Ireland's destiny. While Europe fell into the chaos of the Great Migration, Ireland remained untouched by barbarian invasions, untouched by Roman administration, untouched by Roman collapse. And in that isolation, something extraordinary began to grow. A culture of monks, manuscripts, and scholarship, a golden age that would make Ireland a beacon of learning while the continent burned. In the 5th century, Ireland changed forever, without conquest, without mass slaughter, and almost without resistance.
Christianity arrived. According to legend, it was brought by one man, Saint Patrick, a former slave captured as a boy by Irish raiders, forced to herd animals in isolation, who escaped years later, became a priest, and then made a decision few would dare to make. He returned, not as a captive, but as a missionary. The reality was more complex. Christians were already present in Ireland before Patrick. In 431, Pope Celestine sent a bishop named Palladius to the island. But Patrick became the symbol. He travelled across Ireland, preaching, baptizing local kings, and founding churches. By the end of the 5th century, Ireland was a Christian land, and remarkably, this transformation happened with almost no bloodshed. Why did the Irish accept Christianity so readily? Because the missionaries were clever. They did not destroy the old world, they adapted it. Monks learned the Irish language, they recorded ancient sagas instead of erasing them. Pagan symbols were woven into Christian stories. Patrick used the shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity, 3 leaves, 1 stem. Celtic crosses fused Christian belief with ancient ornament. Sacred pagan sites became Christian holy places. What followed was not the death of Irish culture, but its transformation. And from this fusion of worlds, something extraordinary was about to emerge. A golden age. While much of Europe was collapsing, while Roman roads fell into ruin, cities burned, and knowledge was lost, Ireland was rising. In the 6th century, the island became something no one expected, a centre of learning, a refuge for knowledge. Monasteries spread across Ireland, on wind-swept hills, beside lakes, on the very edge of the known world. These were not just religious communities, they were schools, libraries, scriptoria. Monks lived in simple stone cells. They prayed 7 times a day, and in between they copied books, letter by letter, line by line, often by candlelight. They preserved the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the works of ancient Rome and Greece, texts that were disappearing everywhere else. While libraries burned on the continent, Irish monks were quietly saving civilization. They did more than preserve, they created. Illuminated manuscripts appeared, pages so intricate that even today we struggle to understand how they were made. The Book of Kells, created around the year 800, became one of the greatest masterpieces of medieval art. Spirals, interlaced beasts, vivid colours made from minerals and plants, faith and Celtic tradition woven into ink and parchment. And Irish monks did not stay on the island. They travelled across Europe, founding monasteries in Gaul, Germany, Italy, even in the Alps. Irish scholars taught kings, they debated theology, they studied astronomy and mathematics at a time when much of Europe could not read. Europe gave Ireland a name, the Island of Saints and Scholars. But this golden age, built on isolation and peace, would soon attract attention from the sea.
It began suddenly, without warning, without explanation. In the year 795, unknown ships appeared off the Irish coast. Long, narrow vessels carved with dragon heads. Men stepped ashore, armed, fast, and merciless. They struck a small monastery on the island of Lambay. Monks were killed, buildings burned, treasures were taken. These were the first Vikings. At first, the attacks were quick raids, hit the coast, loot, disappear back into the sea. Monasteries were perfect targets, rich, isolated, poorly defended.
Gold and silver meant nothing to monks, but everything to warriors from the north. Year by year, the raids grew bolder. Viking ships sailed up rivers deep into the heart of Ireland. Sacred places that had stood for centuries were looted in a single night. Then something changed. The Vikings stopped leaving. They began to winter on the island. They built fortified camps, and slowly these camps turned into towns. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick, the first true cities in Irish history. Before the Vikings, Ireland had no urban life. People lived on farms, in ring forts and monasteries. The Vikings brought something new: trade, coinage, shipbuilding, and connections to a wider world. But they did not rule alone. Irish kings fought them and hired them, married into their families, used Viking swords against other Irish rivals. War and commerce, alliance and betrayal, all tangled together. Over time, the Vikings began to change. They converted to Christianity. They adopted the Irish language. They became part of the island. But beneath the surface, resentment remained. The Irish kings had not forgotten who the Vikings were and where they came from. And soon, one man would try to end the Viking Age in Ireland once and for all.
By the end of the 10th century, Ireland was exhausted, divided, weakened. Viking towns dominated the coast. Irish kings fought one another inland. There was no unity, no single authority. Then one man changed the balance. Brian Boru, King of Munster, a skilled warrior, a ruthless politician. Step by step, Brian expanded his power, defeating rival Irish kings, breaking Viking influence, forcing alliances where persuasion failed. For the first time, a single ruler came close to uniting Ireland. In the year 1014, Brian declared himself High King of all Ireland, not just in name, but in fact. His enemies answered. The Vikings of Dublin joined forces with rebellious Irish kings. Warriors came from across the sea, from the Isle of Man, from Orkney, from the Norse world beyond. On the 23rd of April, 1014, the two armies met near Dublin, on the fields of Clontarf. The battle was brutal. Shields shattered, axes fell, the ground ran red with blood. By nightfall, Brian's army had won. The Viking forces were broken. But victory came at a price. Brian Boru, aged 73, was killed in his tent, struck down by a fleeing Viking warrior. Clontarf became legend. Later generations would remember it as the moment Ireland defeated the Vikings forever. The truth was more complex. The Vikings remained. Their cities endured. Their blood mixed with Irish blood. But Brian's dream died with him. The dream of a united Ireland. And in the chaos that followed, the island once again fell apart, leaving it vulnerable to a far greater threat yet to come. After Clontarf, Ireland did not unite. It fractured once again. Brian Boru was gone, and with him the last real chance for a single Irish kingdom. For the next century and a half, Ireland returned to what it knew best: division. Kings fought kings, clans rose and fell, borders shifted with every generation. There was no central army, no unified law, no shared national identity in the modern sense. Power belonged to dynasties. Each traced its lineage back to legendary ancestors. The O'Neills in Ulster, the O'Connors in Connacht, the McCarthys in Munster, the kings of Meath. Every one of them believed they had a rightful claim to supreme authority.
And then, in the year 1169, one decision changed everything. Diarmait mac Murchada, King of Leinster, was driven from his throne by his Irish rivals. Instead of fighting alone, he did something unprecedented. He crossed the sea. Mac Murchada travelled to England and asked for help from King Henry II. Henry did not intervene directly, but he gave permission to recruit Norman warriors from Wales, knights, archers, men trained for conquest. In that moment, Ireland's fate was sealed. What arrived as hired muscle would soon become occupation, and the island, divided and unprepared, stood on the brink of a far greater invasion than anything it had faced before.
What began as a personal dispute soon turned into a national disaster. In the year 1170, the first Norman ships appeared off the Irish coast. They did not come as kings, they came as mercenaries, armoured knights, archers, men trained in continental warfare. Their leader was Richard de Clare, known to history as Strongbow. The Irish had never seen war like this. Heavy cavalry charged through lightly armed warriors. Norman longbows cut down defenders from a distance. Stone castles rose where none had stood before. Towns fell one by one. Waterford, Dublin. Strongbow married Aoife, the daughter of Diarmait mac Murchada, sealing his claim to Leinster. Irish kings fought back, bravely, desperately, but they were divided, and the Normans were not. Within a year, the balance of power on the island had shifted completely. This alarmed a far greater figure, King Henry II of England. Strongbow was becoming too powerful, and independent Norman kingdom in Ireland was not something Henry would tolerate. In 1171, Henry crossed the sea himself at the head of a vast army. Irish kings submitted one by one. They swore loyalty. They bent the knee. With papal approval and overwhelming force, Henry declared himself Lord of Ireland. The conquest was not complete, but it had begun, and it would last not years, not decades, but centuries. The Norman invasion did not end Ireland, it split it. For centuries, two different worlds existed side by side on the same island. Around Dublin, the English crown controlled a small but vital territory, the Pale. Here, English law ruled, English courts, English taxes, English customs. Stone castles guarded the land, English settlers farmed it, and loyalty to the crown was enforced by force. But beyond the Pale, another Ireland survived, Gaelic Ireland, a land of clans and chieftains, of ancient laws known as Brehon law, of poets, genealogies, and warriors loyal not to estate, but to blood and name. But English power faded quickly once it left the Pale. Norman lords who settled deep inland began to change. They married Irish women, learned the Irish language, adopted Irish customs. Over time, many became, as contemporaries said, more Irish than the Irish themselves. This terrified the English crown. In 1366, laws were passed in Kilkenny to stop the process. English settlers were forbidden to speak Irish, to wear Irish clothing, to marry Irish women, to live like the people of the island. The goal was simple, to prevent the English from becoming Irish. The laws failed. By the 15th century, English control had weakened again. Powerful families, the Fitzgeralds, the Butlers, ruled Ireland in the king's name, but on their own terms. Ireland drifted further from direct English rule. But this fragile balance would not last. A new dynasty was rising in England, and it was obsessed with control.
In the 16th century, England changed, and Ireland would pay the price. A new dynasty ruled in London, the Tudors. Unlike their predecessors, the Tudors were not content with partial control. They wanted Ireland, all of it. Not as a loose possession, not as a distant lordship, but as a fully conquered kingdom. In 1541, King Henry VIII made a declaration. He was no longer Lord of Ireland, he was King of Ireland. It was more than a change of title, it was a statement of intent. But Henry did something else, something far more dangerous. He broke with Rome, declared himself head of the Church. England entered the Reformation. Ireland did not. The Irish remained Catholic, not as a political choice, but part of who they were. Faith became identity, and identity became resistance. English armies marched across the island, crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, villages destroyed, not to defeat armies, but to starve populations into submission. Mercy was rare, terror was deliberate. Under Elizabeth I, the conquest accelerated. English commanders ruled by fear, heads were displayed as warnings, lands were seized, clans were broken. Resistance did not disappear, it hardened. Irish leaders learned English tactics, sought foreign allies, and prepared for a final stand. The greatest of them was yet to come.
By the end of the 16th century, Ireland was burning, literally and politically. English power had spread, but it was not secure. Ulster remained unconquered. There, a single man emerged as the leader of resistance. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. He was no primitive rebel. He was educated, spoke English, understood English warfare. And he used that knowledge against England. O'Neill reorganized Irish forces, trained disciplined infantry, used modern firearms, fought on terrain he controlled. In 1598, his army destroyed an English force at the Battle of the Yellow Ford. It was England's greatest defeat in Ireland. For a moment, independence seemed possible. Spain, England's enemy, promised help. Catholic Europe was watching. But help came too late. In 1600, in 1601, Spanish forces landed far to the south at Kinsale. O'Neill marched his army across Ireland in winter, desperate to join them. The English commander, Lord Mountjoy, moved faster. The Irish and Spanish were surrounded. The battle was brief and disastrous. The rebellion collapsed. O'Neill submitted. His lands were spared, but his power was gone. 6 years later, he made his final decision. Hugh O'Neill and the remaining Gaelic lords boarded ships and left Ireland forever. This moment became known as the Flight of the Earls. With their departure, Gaelic Ireland ended. Its leaders were gone, its political system collapsed, and the land lay open for something far worse.
With the Gaelic lords gone, Ireland stood defenceless, not militarily, but politically. And the English crown moved quickly. In the early 17th century, the lands of Ulster, the most Gaelic region of Ireland, were confiscated, not as punishment, but as policy. The project was called the Plantation of Ulster. English and Scottish settlers, Protestants, were brought in by the tens of thousands. They received fertile land, protection, legal rights, everything the native Irish did not. The Irish were pushed aside, driven from good land into hills, bogs, and marginal soil. New towns were built, fortified farms appeared, Protestant communities took root. Ulster changed forever. For the first time, religion and identity became fixed to territory. Protestant north, Catholic south. A line was drawn, not on a map, but in people's lives. The English saw order, the Irish saw invasion. And the resentment would not fade. It would wait, waiting for the moment that Ireland would explode again with far greater violence than ever before.
In 1741, Ireland exploded. Catholic Irish, crushed by land confiscations, discrimination and religious repression, rose in rebellion. Protestant settlers were attacked, homes burned, thousands were killed. Fear spread across the island. In England, the response was brutal. The Civil War had ended, the king was dead, and one man now held power: Oliver Cromwell. In 1649, Cromwell landed in Ireland with an army unlike any before it, disciplined, professional, merciless. His goal was not compromise, it was submission. The town of Drogheda refused to surrender. Cromwell ordered the assault. When the walls fell, every defender was killed. Soldiers, civilians, priests. 3,000 died. Then came Wexford. Again the gates were breached. Again the slaughter followed. Churches were stormed. Women and children were cut down. Cromwell called it divine justice. The Irish remembered it as annihilation. By 1653, resistance was broken. What followed was systematic punishment. Catholic landowners were given a choice: move west into the barren lands of Connacht or die. A phrase was born: to hell or to Connacht. The best land was seized, given to English soldiers and Protestant settlers. By the end of the century, Catholics, the majority of the population, owned only a fraction of Irish land. Ireland was no longer just conquered, it was transformed into a colony, and the scars would never fully heal.
Cromwell was gone, but his system remained. Ireland did not return to peace. It entered something colder, more calculated. By the late 17th century, England no longer ruled Ireland through open slaughter. It ruled through law. A new legal system was created, a web of restrictions known as the Penal laws. Their purpose was simple: to break Irish Catholic society without bloodshed. Catholics were barred from Parliament, from public office, from the army, from education. They could not own weapons, could not own valuable horses, could not buy land. Land, the basis of power, was systematically dismantled. When a Catholic landowner died, his estate was divided among all his sons, unless one converted to Protestantism. If that happened, he inherited everything. The message was clear: convert or disappear. The Catholic Church was outlawed. Bishops were expelled, monasteries closed, priests hunted. Mass did not disappear, it went underground. Services were held in forests, mountains, hidden fields, watched by armed lookouts. By the mid-18th century, Ireland had become a land of extremes. A Protestant elite, a minority, owned almost everything. A Catholic majority, nearly three-quarters of the population, owned almost nothing. The English called it order. The Irish called it survival. And this fragile, unjust system rested on a single crop: the potato. By the 1840s, Ireland was a land on edge. Millions lived on tiny plots of land, and almost all of them depended on a single crop: the potato. It fed families, sustained communities, allowed survival under an unjust system, but it also made Ireland fragile. In 1845, something strange appeared in the fields. Leaves blackened, tubers rotted in the ground. Potato blight, a disease carried from abroad, destroyed the harvest. One year might have been survivable, but the blight returned and returned and returned. 5 years in a row. Hunger became starvation. Families sold everything they owned. Then they sold their tools, their clothes, their roofs. When nothing was left, they died. People collapsed on roadsides, in ditches, in their homes. Entire villages disappeared. Disease followed hunger: typhus, dysentery, cholera. Over 1 million died. 2 million more fled the island. Ships left Irish ports loaded with grain, cattle, butter. Food was exported while people starved within sight of the docks. The British government chose not to intervene. Free market ideology, moral judgment, indifference. Aid came, but late, limited, humiliating. Many Irish concluded that the famine was not simply a tragedy, it was allowed. As one nationalist later wrote, God sent the blight, but England made the famine. Those who could escape did. They boarded coffin ships, crowded, diseased, deadly. Thousands died at sea, but those who survived carried Ireland with them to America, Canada, Australia, and they remembered. The famine did not just reduce Ireland, it reshaped it. Population collapsed, emigration became permanent, and something hardened in the Irish mind. Hunger became memory, memory became anger, and anger would one day turn into revolution.
The famine did not end Irish suffering, it transformed it. Ireland survived, but it was changed forever. In the decades that followed, resistance took new forms, not only rebellion, but organization, politics, memory. Irish identity hardened. Language, culture, and history became tools of survival. Across the ocean, the Irish diaspora remembered and supported the struggle from afar. At the beginning of the 20th century, the moment finally came. Revolution, war, negotiation. Ireland did not win everything it wanted. In 1921, the island was divided. The south became self-governing, the north remained British. A border was drawn not by geography, but by history, fear, and religion. Independence brought freedom. It also brought wounds. Civil war followed. Brothers fought brothers. The scars lingered for generations. And the division did not end conflict. In Northern Ireland, discrimination, resistance, and violence erupted once again. For 30 years, the Troubles consumed lives. Peace came slowly, carefully, not through victory, but through compromise. Today, Ireland is a modern, prosperous country, open, democratic, confident. The Irish language is spoken again, culture thrives, history is remembered, not forgotten. The past still echoes, in politics, in identity, in the question of unity. But Ireland is no longer silent. This is not just the story of an island, it is the story of what happens when empires try to erase a people and fail, of a culture that survived conquest, of memory that outlived hunger, of a nation that refused to disappear. Ireland remains, scarred, resilient, alive.